The letter from the HOA arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly into the stack of bills and advertisements that landed in my mailbox each week. The envelope had the same official HOA logo, stamped in bold ink, the kind that instantly made my stomach tighten. When I opened it, the words were blunt and accusatory. "You are hereby cited for parking in a designated fire lane." I read it twice, then 3 times, staring at the paper as if it would change under my gaze. Fire lane? I wasn't parked in a fire lane. I had been parking in front of my own house, the same place I'd parked for years without a single issue. I looked outside, across the quiet street lined with tidy driveways and manicured hedges. Nothing about the curb outside my home screamed, "Fire lane." No painted red curb. No signage. No posted warnings. Just concrete, grass, and my car, where it had always been. The fine amount stared back at me in bold print. $250. The first I left. It seemed so ridiculous that I almost didn't take it seriously. But then the frustration set in, that slow burn of indignation that only grew hotter the more I thought about it. If they could invent violations like this out of thin air, what was next? A fine for the way I cut my lawn? For the color of my front door? I picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office number printed at the bottom of the notice. After a long hold, a woman with a clipped, businesslike voice answered. "Yes, I received a violation notice," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "It says I parked in a fire lane. I need to see the documentation that shows this area is, in fact, a designated fire lane." There was a pause on the other end, papers shuffling, a keyboard clacking. "Sir," she said finally, "all fire lane designations are in accordance with county code and emergency access guidelines." "Great," I replied. "Then send me the specific documentation for this curb in front of my home. Where's the designation filed? I'd like to review it." Her hesitation was palpable, even over the phone. "Look into that for you," she said, her tone shifting ever so slightly, as though I had asked for something unusual. When I hung up, I had the distinct feeling they didn't have it. The rest of the week, I kept an eye on my mailbox, waiting for the follow-up I'd been promised. Nothing arrived. By Friday, my irritation had transformed into determination. I wasn't just going to pay this fine and move on. If they wanted to call it a fire lane, then they needed to prove it. That was my right as a homeowner. That evening, as I walked outside to grab the trash bins, my neighbor, Linda, waved at me from across the street. "Hey," she called, her voice carrying in the cool night air. "Got one of those violation letters too?" I froze. "You got cited?" She nodded, crossing over with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Yep. Fire lane violation. Same as you. But look at this." She opened it up, and the wording was identical to mine. Same violation. Same fine. Same non-existent explanation. "Did you ask them for the documents?" I asked. Linda smirked. "Of course I did. They brushed me off. Said it was in the rules somewhere. But I've lived here for 10 years. If this street was ever a fire lane, wouldn't they have painted the curb or at least put up a sign?" Exactly. It wasn't just me then. They were blanketing the neighborhood with bogus fines, hoping people would pay without question. That realization lit a fire in me, hotter than the initial anger. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. This was about standing up for all of us. The following Monday, I marched down to the HOA office in person. The building was small, tucked into a strip mall, its walls decorated with framed posters about community values and neighborhood harmony. The irony wasn't lost on me. The receptionist looked startled when I walked in with a folder tucked under my arm. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm here about a violation. Fire lane designation. I've requested documentation, and no one has provided it. So I'm here to see it myself." She blinked at me, then excused herself and disappeared into a back office. I waited, tapping my foot against the tile floor, counting the minutes as they dragged on. Finally, a man in a navy blazer emerged, his expression carefully neutral. "I understand you have some concerns," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Richard, the HOA president." "Richard," I said, shaking his hand but not smiling, I want to see the documentation that shows the curb in front of my house is legally designated as a fire lane. He gestured toward a small meeting room. Why don't we sit down and talk this through? Inside, he pulled out a thick binder, the kind that looked impressive but, I suspected, was more fluff than substance. He flipped through pages of regulations, maps, and bylaws, his fingers moving quickly, as though he knew exactly what he was looking for. But after several minutes, his pace slowed. He frowned, flipping back and forth, his confidence beginning to falter. "That's strange," he murmured. "It should be in here somewhere." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "You fine me $250 for parking in a fire lane that may not even exist. That's a problem." Richard cleared his throat, clearly flustered now. "There must be a record. I'll have to check with the city planning office, maybe the fire marshal. But in the meantime, you're issuing fines without proof," I cut in. "That's illegal. And I'm not the only one. My neighbor got the same notice. So either you produce the documentation, or you rescind the violation. Simple as that." His jaw tightened. I could tell he didn't like being challenged, especially not in his own office. But I also saw something else flicker across his face: doubt. He knew I was right, and he didn't have the evidence to back himself up. I stood up, gathering my folder. "I'll give you 1 week. Either you send me the official designation paperwork, or I'll escalate this beyond the HOA. County, state, whatever it takes. And if I find out you've been issuing fines without proper authority, I'll make sure everyone in this community knows." Richard opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. He just nodded stiffly, his blazer suddenly looking too tight on his shoulders. As I walked out of that office into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started: power. For once, it wasn't them holding the cards. It was me. And I wasn't about to fold. The week that followed felt like a test of patience. Every day when I walked out to my mailbox, I half expected to see a fat envelope from the HOA containing the proof I demanded. Every day, I found nothing but grocery ads and utility bills. Not a word from Richard or anyone else from that office. But something else did arrive. A second notice. This one was stamped with bold red letters across the top: "Final warning." My supposed violation had escalated, and now the HOA threatened to send my debt to collections if I didn't pay within 10 days. I stood in my driveway, staring at the paper, fury coursing through me. Not only had they failed to provide documentation, but now they were doubling down, turning the screws as if intimidation would make me fold. That evening, I called Linda over. She came with her own stack of mail, her expression sour. "They sent me one too," she said, waving the paper in front of me. "Same language. Final warning. Threats of collections. What are they trying to pull?" "They're bluffing," I said flatly. "They don't have the documents, and they know it. They're hoping fear will make us pay." Linda looked at me, her eyes sharp with determination. "So what's our move?" That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about all of us who lived under the thumb of an HOA that thought it could invent rules on the fly. And if I didn't push back now, the next fine would be something else, something even more outrageous. The next morning, I sat down at my desk with a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and started writing. Not an email, not a complaint, but an official demand letter. I cited my rights as a homeowner, the HOA bylaws, and state law regarding due process. I requested again, in writing, the documentation that designated the curb as a fire lane. I gave them 5 business days to comply. I copied Linda on the letter, and she signed her name beside mine. Then we hand-delivered it to the HOA office, dropping it into their locked submission box with a satisfying clunk. By Wednesday, word had spread around the neighborhood. Neighbors who usually gave polite waves from across the street were stopping me at my mailbox, curious, concerned. "Is it true they're fining for the curb?" one asked. Another shook his head in disbelief. I got one too. I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't just me and Linda. Half a dozen families on our street had received the same violation. All of us, threatened with collections for a fire lane that nobody had ever seen marked. It was like the HOA had found a new revenue stream and decided to squeeze every penny it could from us. That Friday evening, we gathered in my driveway, 7 families, folding chairs lined up under the fading sunset. People brought iced tea, cookies, and, more importantly, their violation letters. We spread them out on a card table, comparing wording, dates, and amounts. Each one was identical. "They're running a scam," one man said, slapping the paper with the back of his hand. "This is nothing more than extortion." I nodded. "And we're not paying a dime until they show us the proof." Which, by the way, I don't think exists. "But what if they send us to collections?" a young mother asked, worry etched on her face. "That could ruin our credit." "They can't collect on a debt that isn't valid," I reassured her. "That's why documentation matters. If they can't prove this is a fire lane, the violation is baseless. No judge, no collection agency, is going to enforce it without evidence." The group seemed to relax a little, and I could feel the shift in the air, unity. For once, the HOA wasn't pitting neighbor against neighbor. We were all standing together. The following Monday, I received a call. It wasn't Richard this time. It was a woman who introduced herself as Margaret, legal liaison for the HOA. Her voice was smooth, too practiced. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I'm calling regarding your demand letter. The board has reviewed your request, and we are still in the process of locating the fire lane designation documents. In the meantime, we encourage you to resolve your outstanding balance to avoid further consequences." I nearly laughed into the phone. "Margaret, let me make something clear. Until you provide legal proof that the curb outside my house is a designated fire lane, there is no balance. And threatening consequences without evidence is harassment. Do you understand?" There was a pause. Then she said, "We'll be in touch," before hanging up. That night, Linda suggested we take things a step further. If they won't give us the documents, maybe the city will. Fire lanes have to be approved by the fire marshal, right? What if we go to the source? The idea lit a spark in me. The next morning, I drove to the county office, a squat building with beige walls and a maze of hallways. After some waiting and paperwork, I found myself sitting across from a clerk at the planning department. "I'm looking for documentation," I explained, "that shows the curb in front of my home is a designated fire lane. The HOA says it is, but they haven't been able to provide proof." The clerk raised an eyebrow and tapped on her keyboard. "What's the address?" I gave it to her. She typed for a few moments, scrolling through records. Then she frowned. "That's odd. I'm not seeing any record of a fire lane designation on that street." My heart thumped. "Are you sure?" "Positive," she said. "If it were a fire lane, there would be an ordinance on file, plus visible markings, red paint, signage, sometimes even bollards. I don't see any of that in the system. Honestly, it looks like a standard residential curb." I sat back, a slow smile spreading across my face. The confirmation I'd been waiting for. Proof that the HOA's violation wasn't just baseless, it was fraudulent. Could I get a copy of that record search? I asked. The clerk printed out the page, stamped it with the county seal, and slid it across the desk. "Here you go. That should clear things up." When I walked out of that building, document in hand, the sun seemed brighter, the air fresher. I wasn't just armed with suspicion anymore. I had evidence. That evening, our little group gathered again in my driveway. I held up the stamped paper like a trophy. "The county has no record of a fire lane on our street," I announced. Cheers and laughter erupted around me. Even the worried mother from before looked relieved. "So what's next?" Linda asked. "Next," I said, "we make sure the HOA knows we're done playing games. And if they keep pushing, we take this beyond them. To the county. To the courts. Wherever it needs to go." For the first time, I saw more than frustration in my neighbors' faces. I saw resolve. The HOA had overplayed its hand, and now it was about to learn what happens when homeowners fight back. And this time, they wouldn't be facing just one of us. They'd be facing all of us. By the time the HOA board meeting rolled around, the entire neighborhood buzzed with tension. 4 weeks, residents had been comparing letters, swapping stories, and whispering about what the HOA was doing behind closed doors. And now, for the first time, we were walking in together. Not as isolated homeowners intimidated into silence, but as a united front demanding answers. The community center was already half full when I arrived. Folding chairs were set in neat rows facing a long table where the board usually sat, towering over the room like judges presiding over a courtroom. Linda was already there, saving seats with her purse and jacket draped across them. One by one, the others arrived. Families with kids, retirees, and even the young mother who had once looked so nervous about fighting back. She smiled when she saw me, a small but steady smile that told me she was ready. Richard, the HOA president, strolled in 10 minutes late, his blazer perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back as if nothing in the world could rattle him. He took his seat at the center of the long table, flanked by the other board members, all of whom avoided making eye contact with us. A hush fell over the room as Richard tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm and rehearsed. "Tonight we'll be reviewing general updates, followed by open comments from the community." I almost laughed. General updates? People weren't here to hear about landscaping budgets or pool maintenance schedules. They were here because the board had crossed a line. When the time finally came for open comments, Linda shot me a look. I stood, holding the stamped county document in my hand. My voice carried through the room, firm and steady. "My name is Daniel Thompson. 2 weeks ago, I received a violation notice claiming I parked in a designated fire lane. So did many of my neighbors. We requested documentation to prove this fire lane designation. The HOA has failed to provide it. In fact, I went to the county office myself. According to the official records, no such fire lane exists on our street." I held up the paper for everyone to see. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Richard shifted in his seat, his composure faltering for the first time. "This isn't just a mistake," I continued. "This is fraudulent. You are issuing fines without legal authority. You are threatening collections for something that does not exist. That is harassment, and it is illegal." The room erupted, neighbors clapping, nodding, even shouting in agreement. Richard banged the gavel, trying to regain control. "Order. Please," he barked. "We need order in this meeting." But the people weren't silent anymore. A retired man in the back stood up and shouted, "I got the same letter. You tried to steal money from me." Another voice followed, louder this time, "We want answers." Finally, Richard raised his hands, palms out, feigning calm. "Everyone please. Let me clarify. There may have been an error in the system. An error doesn't happen dozens of times." I cut him off. "This wasn't a typo. This was deliberate." Richard's jaw clenched. He glanced to his right, toward Margaret, the so-called legal liaison. She leaned in, whispering something in his ear. He nodded, then cleared his throat. "The board will investigate this matter further," he said stiffly. "In the meantime, all fines related to the fire lane will be suspended." Suspended. Not rescinded. Suspended. The word tasted sour in my mouth. "Suspended isn't enough," I shot back. "Every violation must be voided. Every fine withdrawn. And every homeowner who already paid must be refunded in full. Otherwise, this doesn't end here. We'll take it to the county, the courts, and the press if we have to." The crowd cheered again, louder this time. Richard's face flushed red. He tapped the gavel so hard I thought it might break. "This meeting is adjourned," he snapped, storming out from behind the table. But the damage was done. The room was electric. Neighbors shook my hand, clapped me on the back, thanked me for standing up. For the first time, the fear was gone. People saw the cracks in the board's authority, and they weren't afraid to push back anymore. That night, as I walked home under the glow of streetlights, Linda caught up with me. "You handled that perfectly," she said. "I don't know," I admitted. "They'll fight back. People like Richard don't give up control easily. He'll find another way to come after us." She nodded slowly. "Then we'll be ready." The next morning, I woke to find a note taped to my front door. My stomach dropped as I pulled it off and read it. "Cease your disruptive behavior or face legal consequences. HOA Board." No signature. No official letterhead. Just a plain piece of paper with a threat scribbled in blocky font. I crumpled it in my hand, fury building in my chest. If they thought intimidation would make me back down, they didn't know me at all. Instead of hiding it, I photographed the note and emailed it to every neighbor who had joined us. Within an hour, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages of support. Some were outraged. Others were afraid. But all agreed on one thing. This was proof the HOA was rattled, desperate, and acting outside the law. That afternoon, Linda knocked on my door, her face tight with concern. "You need to be careful," she warned. "If they're leaving anonymous threats, who knows what they'll do next?" I shook my head. "The only thing they can do is dig themselves deeper. I've got evidence now. That's the one thing they can't fight." But even as I said it, I felt a gnawing unease. The HOA had money, power, and connections. If they couldn't silence me with fake fines, they might try other ways. 2 days later, I found out I was right. A letter arrived, this time certified mail. Inside was a legal notice claiming I was in violation of community standards for harassment of board members. According to the letter, I had disrupted the board meeting, created a hostile environment, and spread false information about the HOA. The notice demanded I cease all attacks on the board or face a lawsuit. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the words over and over. A lawsuit. They were actually threatening to sue me for asking for proof. When I showed the letter to Linda, she snorted in disbelief. "They're bluffing again. They don't have a case." "Maybe," I said. "But even a bluff lawsuit costs money to fight. And they know most people don't have the resources to stand up against them in court." "Do you?" she asked quietly. I looked at the stamped county document on my counter, then at the stack of violation letters my neighbors had given me. "Maybe not alone," I admitted. "But together? I think we do." The HO thought they could silence me with fines, with threats, with lawsuits. But they'd made a mistake. They hadn't just gone after one homeowner, they'd gone after an entire community. And now, that community was ready to fight back. The morning after the certified letter arrived, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the realization that the HOA was playing a different game. A fine you could fight. An anonymous note you could laugh off. But the threat of a lawsuit? That was designed to drain people, to scare them into submission, to make them give up not because they were wrong but because they couldn't afford to be right. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, rereading the legal notice until the words blurred. They had accused me of harassment, of spreading false information, of creating a hostile environment. All because I stood up at a meeting and asked for proof. If this was their definition of harassment, then every homeowner who ever raised a concern was guilty. Linda stopped by later that morning. She didn't even wait for me to offer her coffee. She slammed her own copy of a certified letter on my table. "They sent me one too," she said. "Word for word identical, except with my name on it. These people aren't just after you anymore. They're after anyone who stands with you." We stared at each other, the reality sinking in. This wasn't going to stop unless we pushed harder. The board wanted us isolated, scared, too overwhelmed to resist. The only way forward was together. That evening, we held another driveway meeting, this time with nearly 20 neighbors gathered in folding chairs and lawn chairs, kids darting between us with popsicles while the adults spread out piles of mail and legal threats on the table. People were angry now, angrier than I had ever seen them. "They can't just sue everyone, can they?" one man asked, his hands shaking as he held up his notice. "They can try," I admitted, "but they don't have a case. They're hoping the fear of a lawsuit will be enough to shut us down." "So what do we do?" a woman asked, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to hire a lawyer just to prove I didn't park in a fake fire lane." I leaned forward, lowering my voice so everyone leaned in with me. "We don't fight this alone. That's exactly what they want. They pick us off one by one until nobody dares speak up. But together? We hire one lawyer, as a group. We file one collective response. And if we have to, we countersue." The murmurs turned into nods, then into voices of agreement. By the end of the night, we had a list of names and signatures. Every family on our street was ready to chip in for legal representation. The following week, I met with an attorney downtown, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca who had a reputation for handling HOA disputes. She listened patiently as I laid out everything: the violation notices, the demand letters, the county document, and finally the lawsuit threats. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "They're bluffing," she said confidently. "They don't have grounds for a lawsuit. The county document alone destroys their case. But what they're doing could qualify as harassment and abuse of power. If you wanted, we could turn this around on them." I felt a surge of hope. "You mean sue them?" Rebecca nodded. "Class action. Multiple homeowners, same issue. If they're issuing fraudulent fines, that's not just a civil problem. It could even cross into criminal territory if money was already collected under false pretenses." For the first time, the HOA's threats didn't feel so heavy. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore, we were preparing to go on offense. When I brought the news back to the neighborhood, the reaction was electric. People clapped, hugged, even laughed in relief. Finally, one man said, "They've been bullying us for years. Maybe now they'll pay for it." But the HOA wasn't done yet. 2 days later, trucks rolled through the neighborhood. Workers in reflective vests unloaded buckets of red paint and began slapping it across curbs, our curbs. They were painting fire lanes that had never existed, retroactively trying to cover their tracks. Linda called me in a fury. "Do you see this? They're making it look like the fire lane was real all along." I was already out on my front lawn, watching the workers slop red paint along the edge of the curb where I'd parked my car for years. I marched up to one of them, demanding to know who had authorized it. He shrugged and pointed to a clipboard. "Work order from the HOA," he said. "That's all I know." It was a sloppy, desperate move, and it only made them look guiltier. I took pictures of the paint jobs, noting how uneven and rushed they were, how some curbs were painted only halfway while others stopped awkwardly in the middle of the block. No signage. No fire marshal approval. Just red paint slapped on concrete like a child trying to hide a broken vase. The very next day, Rebecca filed an injunction on our behalf, halting all further modifications until the case was reviewed. Suddenly, the HOA was the one scrambling. They had poked the wrong bear, and now that bear had teeth. At the next board meeting, the turnout was massive. People who had never once attended filled every seat, lined the walls, stood outside the doors straining to listen. Richard sat at the table, his blazer wrinkled this time, his face tight with frustration. Margaret hovered beside him, flipping through papers like a magician fumbling tricks. When the meeting opened, Rebecca stood up. She wasn't loud, but her presence filled the room. "My clients demand that all fire lane violations be rescinded immediately," she said calmly. "They also demand full refunds for every homeowner who paid fines under these fraudulent claims. If this is not resolved within 14 days, we will file suit for harassment, fraud, and abuse of power. Furthermore, the retroactive curb painting is evidence of your misconduct, not proof of your authority." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Richard tried to regain control, stammering something about safety concerns and emergency access, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Neighbors shouted over him, demanding answers. "Where was the fire lane 5 years ago?" someone yelled. "Why wasn't it painted until last week?" Another called. For the first time, Richard didn't look like a man in charge. He looked like a man cornered. That night, as I walked home with Linda, I felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. We had the upper hand, but power doesn't slip quietly from the hands of people like Richard. He wouldn't let go without a fight. And I had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. The tension in the neighborhood felt like a storm waiting to break. 4 weeks, the HOA had ruled with intimidation and silence, but now, cracks were beginning to show. Rumors swirled that not every board member agreed with Richard's tactics. Some were embarrassed, others afraid. And as our group grew stronger, the board's once solid front was starting to crumble. One afternoon, while I was mowing the lawn, a man in a pale blue shirt walked up the driveway. I recognized him immediately, Peter, the HOA treasurer. He looked nervous, glancing around as if worried someone might see him. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I cut the mower and nodded, motioning toward the porch. He sat stiffly, clutching a folder under his arm. "I'm not here on behalf of the board," he said quickly. "This is just me, personally. I can't keep doing this. Richard's gone too far." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "Then why are you still on the board?" His face flushed. "Because I thought I could make a difference from the inside. But this..." He opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table. They were meeting notes, emails between board members. And right there, in black and white, were the instructions. Issue fire lane violations to raise revenue. Use collections threats if necessary. Paint curbs if challenged. I stared at the words, my anger boiling over. So it was intentional. Not just a mistake. Not confusion. A plan. Peter nodded miserably. I wanted no part of it, but Richard controls the majority. He bullies the others into agreeing. But people are starting to question him now. If you keep pushing, I think the board will split. It was the first real sign of weakness I'd seen from inside. And it was all I needed to know we were winning. That evening, I brought the papers to Rebecca. She read them twice, then looked up at me with a smile. "This is gold. Proof of intent. With this, not only can we defend against their threats, we can prove fraud. Richard's not just overreaching, he's abusing his power for financial gain." Word of Peter's quiet rebellion spread quickly, and suddenly neighbors who had been too afraid before started stepping forward. One woman admitted she'd paid over $400 in fire lane fines last year and never questioned it. A retired couple said they'd been threatened with liens against their home for unpaid violations. The pattern was clear. Richard had been using fear to squeeze money out of the community for years. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed, standing room only. People weren't just curious anymore. They were angry, ready for a fight. Richard walked in late again, his expression carefully blank, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Margaret followed behind him, whispering furiously into his ear. When the meeting opened, Rebecca didn't waste time. She stood and presented Peter's leaked documents, sliding copies across the board's table for all to see. Gasps echoed through the room as people read the words for themselves. "This," Rebecca said firmly, "is proof that the board knowingly issued fraudulent fines. This is proof that Richard and others conspired to extort money from homeowners under false pretenses. And this is why we are filing suit if immediate corrective action isn't taken." The room erupted, people shouting, waving their letters, demanding refunds. Richard pounded the gavel, but this time, no one listened. His authority was gone, shattered under the weight of his own greed. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Karen who had always sat quietly at Richard's side, stood up. Her voice shook, but it was strong enough to cut through the noise. "I didn't sign up for this," she said. "I joined the board to help this community, not to exploit it. Richard, I won't be part of this anymore." She pulled her nameplate from the table and walked out. The room exploded in cheers. One by one, other board members began to waver. Some mumbled excuses, others stayed silent, but the divide was clear. Richard was losing his grip. But he wasn't done fighting. "This is all lies," he snarled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Fake documents, fake accusations. A smear campaign led by people who want to destroy this community." "No, Richard," I said, standing up. "We're the ones who care about this community. You're the one who's been destroying it." The crowd roared its approval, drowning out his protests. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. That night, as neighbors lingered outside the community center, talking excitedly about what had just happened, I couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. The tide had turned. The board was splintering, the truth was out, and the community was no longer afraid. But I also knew Richard wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. He still had money, influence, and connections. And if he felt cornered, he might lash out harder than ever. Sure enough, 2 days later, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a private law firm downtown, representing Richard personally. The letter accused me of defamation, claiming my statements at the meeting had damaged his reputation. He demanded a public apology and financial damages, or he would sue me personally in civil court. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter in disbelief. After everything, the fraudulent fines, the threats, the intimidation, he was still trying to silence me with lawsuits. When I showed it to Rebecca, she smirked. Typical bully move. When the institution fails him, he hides behind his own lawyer. Don't worry, we'll handle this. He doesn't have a leg to stand on. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Richard was unraveling, and desperate men did desperate things. That night, as I stood on my porch, the neighborhood quiet around me, I caught a glimpse of movement near my car. A shadow darting away into the darkness. My stomach twisted. I hurried down the steps and found a long, jagged scratch carved into the driver's side door. It wasn't just about money anymore. Richard was making it personal. And I knew then, the fight was far from over. The scratch on my car was the last straw. For weeks, I had endured letters, threats, and intimidation, but now it was escalating into vandalism. I snapped photos, filed a police report, and forwarded everything to Rebecca. If Richard thought fear would silence me, he was about to learn the opposite. The neighborhood rallied stronger than ever. When I showed my neighbors the damage, they were outraged. "He's desperate," Linda said, shaking her head. "He knows he's losing." For the first time, I could see it in everyone's faces. They weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. And anger was far more powerful than fear. Rebecca moved fast. Within a week, she filed a formal lawsuit on behalf of the homeowners. Fraud, harassment, abuse of power, and damages for every bogus fine collected. She also filed a restraining order to prevent any further retaliation against me, Linda, or anyone else involved. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Richard wasn't the accuser anymore, he was the accused. When the lawsuit hit the local news, the story spread like wildfire. Reporters showed up at our street, snapping photos of the hastily painted fire lanes and interviewing neighbors. Headlines read, "HOA fraud allegations rock local community," and "Homeowners accuse board of extortion scheme." For the first time, Richard couldn't hide behind his blazer and gavel. His face was on the evening news, his name tied to fraud. I imagined him watching the broadcast from his pristine living room, seething at the loss of control. The board fractured completely after that. 2 more members resigned, citing ethical concerns. The treasurer, Peter, came forward publicly, confirming the emails and internal notes we already had. He even admitted he had been pressured into silence. The more he revealed, the clearer it became. Richard had orchestrated the entire scheme, and the others had simply gone along out of fear or complacency. Still, Richard fought. His lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to dismiss the case, trying to paint us as a mob of unruly homeowners bent on destroying his reputation. But Rebecca countered each one with calm precision, wielding evidence like a blade. Every time he tried to dodge accountability, she pinned him back down. The hearing finally came on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, many wearing matching t-shirts that read, "We are not afraid." I sat in the front row with Linda at my side, the county document tucked neatly into Rebecca's binder. Richard strutted in with his lawyer, still dressed in his perfect blazer, but his face told a different story. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding the stares of the very people he had once bullied. The judge listened patiently as both sides presented their case. Richard's lawyer argued that the board had acted in the best interest of community safety, that the fire lane designations were merely administrative oversights. But when Rebecca presented the stamped county record, the photos of freshly painted curbs, and the leaked emails showing intent to raise revenue through violations, the courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even the judge's brow furrowed. Then Peter took the stand. His voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as he recounted how Richard had pressured the board, how he had insisted on issuing fines even after questions were raised. "It wasn't about safety," Peter said, his voice steady now. "It was about money. He wanted to fill the HOA's reserves at any cost, even if it meant lying to the people we were supposed to serve." That testimony sealed it. The judge ruled in our favor, declaring the violations unlawful and ordering the HOA to refund every homeowner who had paid. More importantly, The judge stripped Richard of his position, citing abuse of authority. He was fined personally for harassment and ordered to cover legal fees. The room erupted in applause. Neighbors hugged, cheered, even cried. After months of fear and tension, justice had finally landed. As Richard was led out of the courtroom, his face pale and rigid, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. He had thought himself untouchable, a king ruling over his little kingdom. But in the end he had been undone not by lawyers or officials, but by the very people he tried to intimidate. Life slowly returned to normal after that, though normal felt different now. The HOA board was restructured with new members, real neighbors who cared about the community, not power. Transparency rules were introduced, and homeowners now had access to every document, every vote, every expenditure. For the first time, the HOA felt like it belonged to us, not over us. One evening, weeks after the ruling, Linda and I sat on my porch, watching kids ride bikes down the street. The red paint on the curbs had already started to chip, a fading reminder of Richard's desperate ploy. "You realize you started all this," Linda said, sipping her tea. "If you'd just paid that fine, none of this would have happened." I chuckled softly. "Yeah, but then they'd still be getting away with it." She smiled, raising her glass. "To standing up." I raised mine too. "To never backing down." For me, the fight had started with a single letter in the mail, one fine that seemed too absurd to be real. But it ended with something much bigger, a neighborhood that learned it didn't have to live in fear. We had faced down corruption, exposed lies, and reclaimed our community. And as I looked around at the laughter, the chatter, the quiet peace of a neighborhood finally free from intimidation, I knew one thing for certain. The HOA might still exist. Rules might still exist. But so did we. And now we knew just how powerful we could be when we stood together. The fire lane never existed. But the fire it lit in us, that was real. And it wasn't going out anytime soon.